neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. No issue has more defaced our country, nor had more long-term effects than slavery. When we celebrate American freedom, we must also remember the long and painful struggle to share in those freedoms that faced and continue to face generations of African Americans. To understand the present, we must look at our past. Before the Civil War, there were nearly 4 million black slaves in the American South. Of all the crops grown in the South before the Civil War, including sugar, rice, and corn, cotton was by far the largest profit bearer. Millions of acres were turned to cotton production following the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Also, 3/4 of the world's cotton production came from the South. In 1841, a slave catcher kidnapped Solomon Northup, a free black man from Saratoga, New York, on the suspicion that he was a runaway slave from Georgia. When the slave catcher sold him into slavery, Northup lost his family, his home, his freedom, and his name. Solomon was taken to New Orleans, Louisiana, where he was put into a slave pen with other men, women, and children, waiting to be sold. In 12 Years a Slave, a narrative that he wrote after regaining his freedom, Northup describes what it was like to be treated as human property. Freeman, the white slave seller, would make us hold up our heads, walk quickly back and forth, while customers would feel our heads and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths and show our teeth. Sometimes a man or woman was taken back to the small house in the yard, stripped, and inspected more minutely. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit, and hurt his sale. The cotton-picking season that began in August was a time of hard work and fear among the slaves. Only when the slaves finally finished working for their master could they return to their own cabins to spend time with their families and tend to chores at home. The combination of the Louisiana Purchase and the cotton gin made the production of cotton extremely profitable. The cotton gin increased the amount of cotton that one slave could produce in a day by 50%. What this meant was that growing cotton allowed plantation owners to make more money at the expense of a slave's hard work. In 1808, just as cotton was making a greater appetite for slave labor, Congress abolished the ingression of slaves from Africa, sending prices for slaves higher than the price for tobacco. The lives of black people under slavery in the South were controlled by a set of customs, rules, and laws known as slave codes. Slaves could not travel without a written pass. They weren't allowed to learn how to read and write. They could be searched at any time. They could not buy or sell things without a permit. They could not own livestock. They were subject to a curfew every night. Slaves were simply animals to white people. For those who were formerly enslaved, freedom meant an end to whips, to the selling of family members, and the end of white masters. The promise of freedom gave them the hope of independence, education, and their rights as citizens. I agree with the Constitutional Rights Foundation in what they say. America is not done with the illness of racism, in spite of the election of Barack Obama. Yet most white people don't want to talk about or hear about race anymore, and many blacks worry that it is better to just leave it alone for now. We should be uncomfortable with both of these choices. Some old wounds do heal on their own, but despite today's subtle and complicated approach, the current ramifications of racism that is infecting the U.S. is unlikely to be self-healing. Of course, the whole issue of racism had a more direct air in the past. We did not have to employ complex surveys and experiments to reveal its depth. There used to be something loud and obvious and terrible about racism, circumstances with some ironic truths. A visible and openly declared enemy is much more directly confronted than one that operates stealthily. And that is the dilemma of racism in our time. We have hints, suggestions, and indications of racial bias all around us today, but it is typically unspoken, if not altogether invisible much of the time. And where it's not invisible, there is often a plausible cover story that can be given as to why racially biased treatment was somehow justified or legitimate. All of this makes waging the war against racism much tougher. It is now quiet, even rationalized on some grounds, and thereby hidden in plain view, and seemingly, as a consequence, perhaps not such a bad thing after all.